All right, so we've got Module 9. That Module 9 reading was due before we started class today. Oh, there we go. So we'll start Module 9 and finish it tomorrow. After tomorrow, there will be that Module 9 quiz will pop up to you. We'll have the participation quiz for today, which is now available. And I will kind of be using the complete slides. If you want to use the skeleton slides, you can kind of identify, the points where you really should be making sure you're writing down probably what I'm doing on the dot cam. Sometimes a complete version I'll put up, something that looks similar, but I might do additional work on the dot cam. So the skeleton slide is a good way to indicate where you should be maybe writing some things down. Also, before we get started, so I updated module 5 and 6. There was a issue with one of the questions. It was only being counted as 1.25. So I've got all those updated. The scores should now be kind of reflected in Canvas accurately. The other thing I wanted to mention, I put up a test quiz. If you did the participation quiz 7-7 and you got the lockdown browser to work, you don't need to worry about that at all. There was one or two people that didn't get that to work and missed the due date. And so I wanted to make sure I put up a test quiz. It's worth 0 points. It's not going to count towards your grade. You don't have to do it. It simply says, did you get this to work, yes or no? But it's a way to make sure that you're getting that lockdown browser to work before we have that exam this Friday, because that will require that lockdown browser. So it's on you. If you didn't do that participation quiz to make sure you could get that working, you need to make sure you can get it working using this test quiz. Okay. So you've got that set of practice problems. I'll kind of go through most of those questions, or as much time as we have to cover questions on Thursday's class. So we'll be doing a review on Thursday. Other than that, a couple slides will finish up from Module 8, and then we'll jump into Module 9 here today. So unless there's any other questions, we'll go to where we left off. I skipped some slides here on Module 8. So if there's no other questions, we'll kind of get started here on material. Okay. So, whoop, there we go. So we talked last class about the idea that when we have a price change, we're going to have both a substitution and an income effect, right? And we kind of think about, we had this hypothetical budget line. We kind of thought about movements on the same curve, right? If I can get this mouse to work. There we go. Same curve. If I was affording the same amount of total utility, so we've shut down the income effect, but facing different relative prices, that represented A to B, our substitution effect. Keeping the relative prices the same with this hypothetical budget constraint, but we now know that when the price of something goes down, we can afford to buy more. Our real income has went up. Movements from B to C, same relative prices. We've shut down the substitution effect, but we can now afford a higher indifference curve or a higher level of total utility. That was our income effect. So this substitution effect, how large it is, right? We talked about there's this potential that the substitution and income effect work in opposite directions for goods, especially if they're inferior, okay? So what's the kind of dictates the size of that substitution effect would be how strong of substitutes or complements these goods are. So here I've kind of drawn, here these are relatively, large substitutes, right? Pepsi and Coke, very similar products. So we see that when the price of one of them changes, it changes significantly how much of each of those goods people choose to buy. Now, if they're complements, hot dogs, hot dog buns, there, even if we saw the same change in the relative prices, well, because I don't really want to just have a hot dog, I want to have it on a bun, maybe if the price of hot dog buns changes, or the price of hot dogs changes, I might not consume that much less of the other good, okay? Maybe I do still buy some hot dogs. I don't know, people eat them with mac and cheese or something like that for kids. But, right, that size, that substitution effect on the same indifference curve, different relative prices, wouldn't be as large, okay? So we've got some extremes, and I've got some examples up here, but I'll kind of show you why those represent perfect substitutes or perfect complements. So when we're talking about perfect complements, those might be the easier ones to think of. I think I did like left shoes and right shoes, right? It doesn't really benefit me to have just a right shoe or just a left shoe. This is kind of a good example of perfect complements. So what's going to be true about the indifference curves for perfect complements? Well, there, if I have one left shoe, one right shoe, that's really the same to me as if I had one left shoe and two right shoes because I can't wear a right shoe without a left shoe. So here, the total level of utility, or our indifference curve, is going to be that, well, if I only have one of these, only one left shoe or one right shoe, it doesn't matter if I have more of the other, right? So our indifference curves, right, would be like something like this, right? And if we think about where would our budget constraint be, well, if we had a budget constraint, the optimal point is going to be where the slope of our budget constraint is the same as our indifference curve. Well, here we have a weird example. I mean, what is really the slope here? Well, the slope, is completely infinite or zero. So the only point where it's actually tangent or kind of touching that budget constraint is right at that point where I have an equal amount of both goods. This would be if they're perfect complements, okay? So we can kind of think about what's going to happen. This is kind of weird, but let's say all of a sudden, for whatever reason, the price of left shoes decreases, right? Well, I can't get to the same level of indifference or the same indifference curve I could before. Now, where is it going to be tangent to this point? Well, there isn't a point, right? It would kind of be hitting my indifference curve here. I can't afford to have two of both shoes, so what am I going to do? Well, it doesn't benefit me anymore to have one left shoe and two right shoes. So we end up, that price change might actually push us down to this kind of kink point or this kind of corner. Now, I'm not going to give you examples with perfect complements on the exam or a quiz. This is just, kind of to solidify this idea that when I have perfect complements, price changes in one of those goods automatically forces me down to kind of this point where I'm only going to have the same amount of each. Okay. Now, what would perfect substitutes look like? Well, there, if I had two goods, and maybe this is like here, I'll do Coke and Pepsi. If I view these as the exact same product, I don't care, it's cola, right? I don't care what brand it is. Maybe for me, my indifference curve is actually, I have the exact same amount of utility if I have, say, 1 can of Pepsi, 10 cans of Coke, or 10 cans of Pepsi, 1 can, right? They're perfect substitutes, right? Always, to get one more of that x-axis, or one more unit of the x-axis good, I would always give up 1 unit of the y-axis good. So if I have kind of this perfect substitute example, what is the slope always going to be here? -1. Okay? I view these goods as exactly the same, essentially. So you'll notice what's going to be true about kind of our indifference curve. Well, whatever our relative prices are, right, my indifference curve, or sorry, what's going to be true about my budget constraint, when it's exactly equal, right, I don't really care what point I have here. So if I had a budget constraint that had a slope of -1, given the prices of these two goods, I don't care. We don't really actually know where the consumer optimum is going to be. Okay. And then what happens if there's a price change so that the relative prices isn't -1? Well, that would mean I can't get out to any of these points. These are now all unaffordable. But what point is still affordable? This point here. If they're perfect substitutes, whichever good is relatively cheaper, I'm only going to buy that good. Right? So perfect substitutes, we can kind of end up with, like, we don't quite have like this tangency between our budget constraint and our income or indifference curve. It could be we end up with, okay, the relative prices isn't -1. That just means we're going to buy whichever of these two goods is cheaper. Now, in reality, we don't have quite often perfect substitutes or complements. It's going to be something in between. Kind of notice here, if the price of Pepsi was going up, what happened? Well, we substituted, quantity of Pepsi went to 0, and we only bought the other product, so we bought a lot of the other products. Right? So there's a huge substitution effect when they are perfect substitutes. Right? Now, here, I could actually have changes in the price anywhere in this range, I can't afford to have two of both. I'm only going to have one of each. There we could actually see price changes in left shoes. And what would that do in this range? It would still force people to kind of buy the same quantity of each, quantity of one. So there, my quantity for both goods, if they're perfect complements, might not change. Okay? So when they're closer to perfect substitutes, we get really large changes in the quantity. When they're closer to perfect complements, we might have really small changes. Okay, so that's what is depicted here, right? When they're closer to perfect substitutes. So what a perfect substitute would be, this indifference curve is a line, but here it's, it's getting close to being a straight line. We have really large substitution effects. When it's getting closer to that like 90-degree angle indifference curve, well, there we have really small. Okay, so I don't know, just kind of the extremes. One way to think about how the size of this substitution effect might be different for different goods when we see that x-axis good experience a price change. Or we could do the other way. We could also do a change in the y-axis good as well. Okay. So the ones that are kind of not bowed inward very much, those would be more like close substitutes. And then things that are bowed towards this origin point of 0, 0 a lot, or they get closer to that like 40, that 90-degree angle indifference curve, those would be closer to perfect complements. Okay. And then we talked through all this last class, different goods. So we've got kind of this idea that when the x-axis good was experience a price change, we had both a substitution and an income effect. Right? So we could think about initially, let's say we were starting out buying just pizza and soda, and the price was $4, we buy 150. We could then plot that point. So that would be the quantity of soda is 150 when the price is 4. If the price then goes to $2, we said, all right, the price of soda has now went down. We're going to kick out that budget constraint. We can now afford to get to a higher indifference curve. So that total effect, where we're moving from, where we're moving to, now at a price of $2, I might be consuming, well, my animation is a little off, 350 here. So I would plot that point. And then if the price of soda decreases even more to $1, I would figure out where's the new point, plot that. So basically, for all those different prices, I would shift that budget constraint, figure out where the quantity would be after that kind of price change, and I could plot all those points. That would give me the demand curve for my product. Now, we're only going to be looking at linear demand. In practice, we actually see that demand will have kind of this bowed inward shape to it as well. Okay. Now, I'm not going to ask you to derive a demand curve, but it's worth mentioning here. Through this total effect, we see from a price change, we could map out what those prices are, what the corresponding quantities, and that's where that demand curve actually comes from. Okay. All right, so that should do it for Module 8. We will now jump into Module 9. Okay. So Module 8 was all about consumers. Module 9 is going to be all about producers. Okay. Did I say that? Module 8 was about consumers. Module 9 is about producers. There we go. So we're going to do a couple definitions first, and then we'll kind of dive into some more of the topics and principles applying to costs. So explicit costs, right, are going to be for a firm anything that they actually, the easiest way to think about it, anything that you have to pay money for, or they actually hand over money for. Now, physically handing, this might be through, bank wires and things like that, but it's things I actually have to pay money for. So rent, raw materials, my labor, I have to pay them. Implicit costs may not require me to hand over a certain amount of money, but it could be something that I'm foregoing, right? So we'll go through some examples of this, but you can kind of think about if I take a job, let's say, I don't know, I'm in Bloomington and I'm a lawyer and I choose to work for the university, right? And they pay me a certain amount of money. I don't know what I'm handling for them. And I'm making, I don't know, $150,000 a year. But I could be working as a lawyer at one of the local firms and making $175,000, right? So the wages I'm foregoing from somewhere else, that's what we would consider implicit costs. By choosing to work at the university, I am not making more money somewhere else. Okay. So we also can think about opportunity costs. If I'm using money to pay workers, pay rent, I'm not using that money to make investments. If I were to use that money to make investments, what am I foregoing? The amount of interest or kind of the ROI I would be getting on that amount of money invested. So whether I'm using my time, right, towards putting it towards a certain job and not putting it towards others, or I'm using my money or capital to produce products, I'm not using it to make investments, I might have opportunity costs there. We would call those implicit costs. Okay. And then the total cost would just be the sum of the two. So I don't know, I can kind of think of a little example here. If you're choosing to go to school for an additional year, let's say, I don't know, I think I looked it up, room and tuition, I think at IU, out of state was like one more year is 40,000, right? So this is like my tuition, kind of room and board costs. Just it's roughly this. I think it might have been something different, but to give a nice number to it. Now, let's say by having this additional year of school, I expect, over my lifetime, I don't know, to make, and this is probably way underselling it, but an additional $200,000 total, right? So I think that I'm going to be making $200,000 extra if I go to school for one more year of whatever job or profession I'm choosing. So this is going to be like my wages here that I'm making. So I look at this and I might say, oh, well, 200,000, that's like my marginal benefit, right? Or the payoff to going to school for one more year. My costs, 40,000, right? Looks like I would kind of gain 160,000. Looks like I should go to school for another year, right? Well, that could be the case. However, I'm not factoring in what could I be doing with my time if I wasn't attending university. I could be working a job. Now, generally, if I could, maybe I could just get a job and maybe it would only be paying $40,000. Well, I'll change it so it doesn't match up with this. We'll say 50,000. So these would be kind of the wages I'm foregoing by taking all of my time and putting it towards studying and going to school. So really, what is my total kind of net benefit here? Well, I'd be making, if I go to school, an additional $200,000. I spent 40,000 to go to school, but I was also giving up making 50,000 somewhere else. So my net benefit is really only not 160, but 110,000. Now, it's still positive. So in this example, you should still choose to go to school for an additional year. But here I've got, what if I had the same setup? I had a student who's currently basically in the minor leagues for IndyCar racing. And so let's say that by going to school an additional year, he's giving up the opportunity maybe to make it to the next level where he could make a pretty sizable amount of money. Let's just say, for the sake of this example, he can make $150,000. So now the wages for gone. Actually, no, I want this to prove a point. Let's say 200,000. Okay. Well, now what is his total cost of going to school? He makes an additional 200,000 having this initial year of school, spends $40,000 in tuition, but he's giving up making $200,000 at this professional kind of racing thing. He'd actually be what? $40,000 in the hole from choosing to go to school for an additional year. So should he go to school? No. Now, I think I'm exaggerating how much money he can make, but I'm just kind of making the point. People that have these other talents, I think about people going to university, even if you can make a ton of money, if you put it towards like goofy things like, social media, or maybe an influencer or whatever it is, well then, yeah, if you're foregoing a bunch of wages, if you make $200,000 doing something else, then you wouldn't choose to go to school. Okay. So this idea of factoring in, so I think here I kind of have the total like costs. If I'm factoring in my explicit costs, and here I think I did this one was in-state tuition, maybe it's about $30,000, right? But I could be making 40,000. This is the average wage of a construction worker in Indiana. So really my total costs are more than double the like sticker price of that college degree, or the additional year of college, I should say. So really my total cost every year when I go to school is not that 28,000, it'd be 28,000 plus this 40,000 wages I'm foregoing by not working. So I'm, quite a bit higher. Okay. So this idea of not factoring in our implicit costs, it could dramatically change our decision to go to school. Well, we're thinking about firms, right? So what is the firm's main objective? They want to maximize profits. So after this next exam, we'll dive deeper into markets and firm decision making. they're always going to we're assuming they're maximizing profits. Profits are essentially the net benefits, right? The difference between revenues and costs. Okay? However, we have two types of profits that we're going to be discussing. The first is accounting profits. So all the accounting profits are essentially what you would see on the accounting books, right? You just look at money coming in, money going out, right? Money going out, that's things you're handing money over, that's explicit costs, right? So if I've got my revenues and minus my explicit costs, that would be accounting profits, right? However, when we're talking about firms maximizing profits, they want to maximize economic profits, right? They want to be using their resources in a way that maximizes the total amount of money they're making minus whatever the explicit costs are, but also, we could kind of break this down, not just, so their total costs would be their explicit costs, but also whatever their implicit costs are, okay? So if the implicit costs start to get pretty high, if I'm, foregoing larger amounts of money by not investing that money in a certain, investing that capital into mutual funds or whatever, potentially my economic profits could be negative, right? When in fact, my accounting profits still could be positive. So our goal of the firm is to consider those opportunity costs or those implicit costs or maximize economic profits. So kind of a little basic example here. Let's say I've got someone, they're thinking of owning a restaurant. And this kind of shows why implicit costs matter. So here's, the revenue they can make from selling all of their whatever food they're making at this restaurant. They've got to pay their employees. They've got to buy the raw materials of the food. They have to pay rent on the building. They have some machinery, ovens, things like that. Their accounting profits would simply be take that revenue they can earn minus all of these explicit costs. So it looks like here, okay, if I open my restaurant, I'm making net, the net benefit here with my accounting profits would be $100,000. What if instead I could be making money though, instead of owning my own restaurant, running my own restaurant, I could be working as a chef for someone else making 150. Well, if I own my restaurant, I was making 100. If I work for someone else, I make 150. If I just care about money, so we're not factoring in, like, I don't know, maybe the intrinsic value of there's some dollar amount I like, being my own boss. Let's just say they just care about money. Well, I actually should be working for someone else as a chef. I'd be making $50,000 more. And in fact, if I determine the economic profits of owning my own restaurant, it would be that same sales revenue minus my explicit costs, but I would also subtract my opportunity costs that I'm not working as a chef for someone else. There, the total economic profits of owning my own restaurant would actually be negative 50,000. Well, if the total profits are negative, should I choose to do that? No. I'd actually be better off if I chose to work as that professional chef. Okay? So economic profits being negative, I should not choose to kind of own this restaurant. Now, let's say I was only making $50,000 somewhere else, right? So now I'm only foregoing $50,000. But let's also say all that money I was putting towards, food, things like that. If I had invested it, maybe I could get a return on investment of $10,000. Okay? So there, I would factor in what are my implicit costs. It's now the wages I'm foregoing, only $50,000, but I'm also foregoing the amount of interest or the mutual funds would pay out if I had invested that $400,000 or $400,000 somewhere else. Right? So kind of notice here, I've got a positive economic profit still. So I would still be better off running this restaurant even after I factor in these implicit costs. So just because we have implicit costs doesn't necessarily mean I'm not going to choose to own this restaurant. It's just that it makes the total economic profits a little bit lower than if I didn't take into consideration my implicit costs. Right? And then we saw in some scenarios, the implicit cost could change my decision if I maximize economic profits compared to just maximizing my accounting profits. Oh, any questions on that idea before we keep moving? Go through this a little bit quicker. It's not too crazy. You want to have to save some time for the more difficult stuff later on. So with this idea of implicit cost, we're also going to have a term that we use and we see once we talk about firm decisions. which is sunk costs, right? So a sunk cost is going to be something that we should ignore in our decision-making process because it is a cost that is what we call like non-recoverable. It has to be paid no matter what we do. So if I'm thinking about owning the restaurant or not, I'm going to have to pay. Maybe if I'm already locked into a rental agreement, it doesn't matter if I decide to open the restaurant. I've agreed to pay for the next year whatever the rent is. So if I choose to own or open the restaurant or not, I still have to pay that. I already signed the contract. Okay? So sunk costs should be ignored, right? Because essentially, it doesn't matter what I do, they're going to be there in both scenarios. Okay. Kind of the term, a little bit, we use in America, there's no use crying over spilled milk. It's already spilled, right? Don't cry about it, right? If you cry, it's still spilled. Okay. So here's like a sunk cost example to kind of show why it shouldn't change our decisions, right? So let's say I'm going to go to a movie. I don't know. There's a outdoor movie place. I'm thinking is it south of? No, it's north, somewhere north of Bloomington. And let's say the ticket costs $10 just to make it a nice, easy number, right? So if I'm choosing to go to the movie, it must be that marginal cost of $10, right, was still below my marginal benefit if I'm choosing to go, okay? So I look at my wallet and I realize I lost the $10 that I was going to use to spend on that. Do I still go? Well, if I choose not to go, what's my payoff? -10. I already lost the $10. If I choose to go, well, before, if I was choosing to go, we said it must mean the marginal benefit was greater than marginal cost of 10. So if I spend another $10, well, now my total cost is 20. But let's assume I know my marginal benefit must have been greater than 10. So if my marginal benefit was 20, now if I don't go, I get -10. If I go, 20 minus 20 is 0. 0 is better than -10, right? So I should still choose to go if my initial decision, yes, my marginal benefit was above that $10, my marginal cost. What if I lose the ticket, right? I already spent the money. It's the same idea. Yes, I spent the $10. If I don't go, I'm out $10. My payoff is -10. If I choose to buy another ticket, well, now I spent another 10. I've got -20, but I've also got a marginal benefit of 20. I've got a kind of my net benefit is 0. 0 is better than -10. I should still choose to go. Okay. So this is kind of a little basic example with like thinking about if you lose money or you lose a ticket, should you go back and get another? But firms really make the same decisions, right? So let's say I have a huge loss this past year, but when I'm making decisions for the future, that loss, it's going to be there no matter if I choose to stay open or I don't. So I need to be making decisions that look at the future costs and the future benefits. If I've got this huge loss I had in the current year, it's there no matter what I do moving forward. Okay. So essentially, by ignoring sunk costs, we can minimize our losses a lot of the time. Okay? So what do we say to the sunk cost fallacy? Not today. If I fall victim to the sunk cost fallacy, that would be like, oh, okay, I lost this ticket. I'm out the $10. I should just choose not to go. Well, no, you choose to go or not, you're out that $10 either way. So when you're comparing the net benefits of both scenarios, you're going to have a -10 on both sides. Right? So we'll kind of return to this idea of sunk costs, probably not today. I don't think we'll quite get there, but definitely in tomorrow's class, right? And thinking about something that represents sunk costs to the firm. Okay. We're also going to have a difference in how we reference firms' decisions, either the long or the short run. So in the long run, we assume that everything can be changed. So every factor of production, I usually kind of use like buildings, right? In the short run, if I'm, have a production facility, I might be forced to be producing wherever my current building is, right? I can't change that overnight, right? However, in the long run, I can buy a parcel of land and build a larger production facility so that in the future I can produce even more, right? So in the long run, I can change everything, right? If you give me enough time, I can build a new production facility. I could find a new CEO. I could, find a new cost. I can change all these factors of production. In the short run, some things are fixed, right? So I can't just up and move buildings overnight, right? I can't, hire a new CEO, fire and find a new CEO. Well, I guess kind of you could overnight. But really, you shouldn't, right? You should take a much longer period of time to make sure you're getting a good CEO there, right? Now, so we typically think of like capital and land. So maybe this is things like machinery. I also can't just upgrade my machinery overnight. It's going to take a longer period of time. So usually think of land, buildings, capital, those are fixed. The one thing we can change in the short run, always change, is we can hire and fire workers every day, right? Every hour if we wanted to, right? So typically we think about labor is generally going to be the thing we can change in the short run. But there will be some things in the short run that we call fixed, right? Or we can't change them quickly. Okay? So with this idea in mind, we're going to focus on the short run first and thinking about what is the thing we can change in the short run. We can hire and fire workers. And as a result, what are workers doing? They're generating additional product. So if I hire more workers, I can produce more units of my good. If I fire them, I can produce fewer. And this doesn't have to be like physical products. This could be, if I'm thinking about even like I don't know, like an insurance agent, right? It might be the number of clients that I can go out and find and help, right? If I hire more workers, they can go out and find more individuals that want to have insurance through us. If I fire them, I don't have as many. I won't, my product is like how many, insurance agreements that I'm selling. So it doesn't have to be like a physical product, like a, book or a, food product or something like that. But whatever example, we can work through a bunch of different examples. It's anything where I can hire and fire workers, and as a result, I can get more or less production. Okay. So with our number of workers, every number of workers is going to have a corresponding quantity of the product that we can produce, right? So we'll call this our production function. So there's some function given what our current capital is. So these are things like the buildings, the machinery that we own, and our current number of workers, labor. There's some function that tells us how much output we can get. Right? So maybe even if I have a large production facility, if I've got one worker, well, they can only operate one machine at a time. So it takes them a longer time to kind of produce those first 10 units. If I hire a second worker, they specialize on different equipment. They can produce maybe now 30 units, etc. Okay. So this function, we're going to use a graph or a table to kind of represent this. We won't actually be dealing with a functional form. So I'll only give you examples where we have a graph or table. We could do it with an actual function. It just becomes the math is a little bit more tricky and in depth. Right? So I'll use this example initially thinking about Chipotle. Right, so I've got a store owner. They've got the the building space that they're renting, or that they've paid for the land to build their location. But they can hire as many workers or fire as they want. Okay, so let's think we first start out. Here's the number of workers we hire and the number of burritos that we can make and sell a day. Right, so if I have 0 workers, I can't sell any burritos. Right, there's nobody working at my store. The first worker, right? Okay, well, they're taking the order, they're going down the line, adding whatever meat, rice you want, wrapping it up, going to the register, ringing you up, taking your credit card. They're doing everything, right? So maybe I can get 1,000 burritos. If I hire that second worker, right? Well, okay. The second worker, now my workers can specialize a little bit. Maybe one of them is the one that's building the burritos, one of them is just running the cash register. So I can't get another 1,000. I hired the best worker first, right? So they added the highest number of burritos, 1,000. The next worker only added 800, right? But I was still having, an increase in my quantity when I hired more workers. And then third worker doesn't add quite as much, fourth, not near as much, etc. Right? So basically, I'm going to hire the best worker first, or who can produce the highest number of my product or burritos in this example. And then I'll hire the next best worker second, next best third, so on and so forth. So here are the different combinations of the number of workers I have and the total product that I'm getting. So you'll notice here what's happening to the slope of this production function. It's getting flatter, which essentially is representing our marginal product of labor. Okay, so if I want to calculate the marginal product of labor, it's how much output does each additional unit of labor add, or each additional unit of whatever input we're looking at add. Here I chose labor. This could be if we're thinking about like if I can change some type of machinery day to day, or another input, I could do the same thing. So here we'll just focus on labor. So if I'm thinking about the marginal anything, it's the change in what I'm looking at. So marginal benefit, it was the change in the total benefit divided by the change in quantity. Marginal product of labor, it's the change in the output I'm getting, or the product, divided by, well, I'm not changing quantity, well, I am, but I'm changing the quantity of labor. Okay, so we calculate, anything marginal the exact same way. What do I want to find the marginal of? The marginal product or the change in my output? What is that coming from? I'm changing not the number of units that I'm producing, but the number of workers I'm hiring. Okay, so my marginal product of labor would just be, okay, if I'm moving from these 2 points, what was the change in output? It was going from 0 to 1,000, divided by a change in the number of workers, or the quantity of labor, divided by 1. So 1,000 over 1, my marginal product of labor there is 1,000. Then moving from the first to the second worker, what was the change in the output? 800. Change in the number of workers, I've kept this easy, just 1, so 800. So what's happening to my marginal product of labor, or what's happening to the slope of my production function? It's decreasing, right? I'm hiring less and less efficient workers as I hire more workers. I hired the best worker first, next best second, so on and so forth, right? So, I was showing you in the graph there, if I had a table, all I'm doing is taking the change in the output, or the quantity, divided by the change in the labor to get that marginal product of labor, okay? And then we said, what's happening? Oh, it's decreasing, okay? Any questions on that? It shouldn't be too crazy here, okay? Now, what if I had, instead of jumps of 1, I don't know, maybe these numbers represent the total number of burritos like across, I don't know, every store in the county, or something like that. Well, if I hire 10 workers, the first 10 workers, and I get additional 1,000, or maybe I'm looking at, like, not the hourly, hour by hour, but I'm looking at every day. I need to have 10 different workers or something like that. Well, there, to calculate my marginal productivity of labor, it's the change in the output, now divided by the change in the number of workers. It won't be divided by 1, it's divided by 10. So we go through the same process. It's just now, if I'm getting 1,000 burritos from now having to hire 10 workers, each additional worker is only adding 100 burritos, or the marginal product of each unit of labor is only 100. And then, hiring the next 10 workers, going from 10 to 20, change in the output or quantity is 800, change in the number of workers is 10, 800 over 10 is 80. And I would kind of go through the rest of these. Once again, I still would see that the marginal productivity of labor, as I hire more workers, I'm hiring the best 10 workers first, then the next best 10, so that marginal productivity of labor is decreasing, okay? All right, so I've got an additional example here, maybe not quite as obvious, but I've got units of labor of 1. I think this would be pretty easy if I had this like on a participation quiz. So let's say I've got, the bushels of wheat, the number of workers I'm hiring. What's the marginal product of labor of the 5th worker? Well, if I'm looking at the 5th worker, how would I go higher? I'd have to be going from 4 to 5. So the change in the number of workers I have would be 1. The change in the output I'm getting, well, I had 64 bushels at 4 workers, 75 at 5. So that change would be what? 11. So 11 divided by that change of 1, that marginal productivity of labor of the 5th worker would be 11. So even if I didn't give you these numbers, what should be true if I calculate, say, the marginal productivity of labor of the 2nd worker? If I know the marginal productivity of labor for the 5th worker is 11, I know the marginal productivity of labor for the 2nd should be something greater than that, right? As I hire more workers, my marginal product of labor should be falling. Sure enough, if I go ahead and calculate it, what was the change going from 1 to 2 workers? Well, that 2nd worker, how many bushels of wheat did they add? What, 36 minus 19, so 17, divided by the change in labor of 1. The marginal productivity of labor of the 2nd worker was 17, which was higher than that of the 5th. Okay. All right. So with this idea in mind, right, I've kind of already mentioned this, but we can see that this marginal productivity of labor that we were calculating with this Chipotle example is decreasing, right? So it's diminishing. Right? So this would explain why that slope of our output, our production function, was getting flatter and flatter. The slope of that production function was essentially the change in output, or the change in the number of units we were producing, from a change in the number of workers. So if our marginal product from each worker is going down, the total amount that was being added to our total product, or the amount that it was changing by, is going down. Okay? So you kind of think about here, that slope is getting flatter and flatter because each additional worker we hire, it's going to change the quantity by a smaller and smaller amount. Okay. So you can kind of, just take these points, put them on a graph, and really that change in between each point, that slope tells you your marginal product of labor. Okay. So in general, and here I'm going to walk back what I've been saying a little bit. In general, when we use more of any factor of production, the marginal product will be decreasing. Okay. So when this was labor, we said the marginal product of labor, as we hire more workers, hiring less and less efficient workers, it's going to decrease. Okay. So we hire the most productive worker first, then the next best, etc. However, in practice, we don't always see that we have diminishing marginal product of labor. In fact, initially, we might actually see that the marginal product of labor goes up. So if we think about my Chipotle example, right? Our workers can specialize. So when I hired that first worker, they had to do everything, right? Well, once I hire the second, one of the workers, whoever's the best at building burritos, can just do that. Whoever's the best, or relatively better at running the cash register now just does that. Together, there's somewhat, you might hear this kind of word in Kelly, but like synergies, or essentially each worker can focus on a specific task. They become even more productive than when they had to do every single task. So when we hire initially these low levels of quantities of labor, like low number of workers, we might actually see that as I hire more workers, the marginal product of each worker actually is going up a little bit because they're specializing in what they're doing at the in the production process. Okay. So we typically only think about the portion of the marginal product of labor curve that's diminishing because ultimately we want to know how many workers should I hire. Well, if hiring more workers, they're becoming even more productive. Think about it this way. If I was okay hiring the first worker at whatever their productivity level was when I compared that to their cost, well, if the second worker is the same cost, but now even more productive, I'm definitely going to hire them. So we always know that when we're on this gains from specialization portion of our marginal product of labor curve, we're definitely going to be hiring more workers. Now, the only thing, the interesting thing with our decision making is, well, once it starts to fall, what is the last worker where the additional output added is above the additional cost? So we know that the point that we stop at in terms of how many workers we hire will always be on that diminishing portion of the marginal product of labor curve. But we still do have this. So typically when we kind of draw this out, there's initially going to be this little like uptick here in the marginal productivity of labor. So for every unit of labor where I am seeing the marginal product increase, I must be having gains from specialization because I'm still hiring the best worker first, next best worker second. It's just when I'm hiring more workers here, they can specialize on tasks and become even more productive than they were before. Now, eventually we get to a point where I've got a certain number of workers where they've I've kind of exhausted those gains from specialization. Now, when I'm adding another worker, now I'm adding like the seventh best worker, the marginal product starts to fall again, right? And then this diminishing returns portion is going to be, we know we're going to stop somewhere here. Right? We don't know where yet, but somewhere. Okay? So this is kind of the idea, if I'm adding more cooks, eventually we kind of get to this point where adding more cooks in the kitchen, right? This saying, it starts to actually decrease how productive each cook is. And in fact, you can imagine there's some level where the marginal productivity of labor could be negative. Now, should we ever get to that point? Hopefully not. In my Chipotle example, this would be like if I had, 7 people behind the counter and one of them doesn't have a task to do, so they're just standing around getting in the way, right? That's where you would see the marginal productivity of labor become negative and the total product actually starts to go down. Okay. Now, we never see that in practice, but just to kind of, talk about this idea a little bit more. So with this idea of the marginal productivity of labor, we're also going to start to think about averages. So we'll do the same thing once we get to cost, but we've got the marginal product of labor, we also have the average product of labor. So the average, it's simply the way we would calculate any other average. You'll just take the total and divide it by the number of numbers you have. So in our case, what are we adding up? It's our total output. What's the number of numbers that we're going to have? Well, it's how much each worker is producing. So divide that by the number of workers. Okay? That would give us our average product of labor. Okay? Now, what's going to end up being true is when that marginal product is above the average, our new average is going to be higher. When the marginal productivity of labor is below the current average, our new average is going to be lower. And if they were exactly the same, it's not going to change. Okay? So you can kind of think about it this way. If currently the average product of labor is 100 and I've got 5 workers, right? So what would that mean? It means my total output is 500. I've got 5 workers. The average is 100. Well, if I add a worker and their marginal productivity, they add 200 units, well, that's above the old average. Now I'm going to have a total output of 700. 700 divided by now not 5, but 6 workers. It's going to be a little bit higher than it was before, right? So what does that work out to be? 116 maybe, if I'm doing math in my head correct. But regardless, it's going to be greater, right? Something above 100. So if I had a set of numbers, right, just to kind of make this point, if I told you, I think just intuitively, maybe I'll use a sports example here. Like, let's say someone's average number of points scored per game, right? So their average points per game was 20. If all of a sudden, this next game, they score 30 points, the marginal number of points here is above the old average. What does my new average have to be? It's going to be a little bit higher than it was before. Or think about it this way. You want to think about it in terms of a grade. Let's say your current quiz grade, on average, you're getting, I don't know, 15 out of the 18 points. Well, if you get an 18 on this next quiz, so this was like your old average, this is the marginal kind of quiz grade. If I do better on this next quiz than I have in the previous ones, what's going to happen to my new average? Well, my new average should be higher, right? And then, well, what if I currently have an average quiz grade of 15 and now I get a 10? Well, I'm doing worse than I was prior. Now, when I add this in, my new average should be lower if my quiz performance is below what my previous average was. So that's all we're really saying there with that relationship between the marginal productivity of labor and the average product of labor. Okay? So we'll look at some numbers here. I think. There we go. So let's say I had the number of workers I'm hiring, and I've got the total output here. So I think this is going back. Now I've initially got what? That first worker, the additional output, I was getting 800 units, hiring 1 worker, so the marginal productivity of labor was 800. The second worker, the change in output was 1,000. I'm hiring 1 more worker, so my marginal productivity of labor was 1,000. So what happened going from 1 to 2 workers? My marginal productivity of labor is going up, so I must be having gains from specialization. Now, once I get to that third worker, what's the change in my total output? Only 600. I added 1 more worker, so now my marginal productivity of labor starts to fall past 2 workers. Now I've got my diminishing returns. Now, if I calculated the average product, well, total over the total number of workers, 800 over 1 is 800. Total output, 1,800 divided by 2 workers is 900. Total output, 2,400 divided by 3 is 8. Here's my average product of labor. So notice, when my marginal productivity of labor is above my old average. So if I start out at 1 worker, when I hire the second, their marginal productivity of labor is 1,000. That's above my old average. What's going to be true about my new average? It's a little bit higher. However, if I hire the third worker, their marginal productivity of labor is below the old average, so my new average is going to be a little bit lower. And that's going to be true for the remaining kind of values here as well. Okay. So visually, if we were to plot these points, what does this look like? Something like this, right? So I'll draw, I think, a better graph. I sometimes put things in the slides to kind of have placeholders for people who don't watch the videos, but I'll build this out for us, right? So if I'm thinking about the number of workers here, or the quantity of labor, and then here we're thinking about this as like our total output, or the quantity of the product that we're seeing. So my marginal product of labor, right, is going to look something like this, right? Where we said initially, when the marginal productivity of labor is increasing, this is where we had gains from specialization. The portion where the marginal productivity of labor is decreasing, this is going to be where we now see diminishing returns taking over. Okay, we're hiring less and less efficient workers. Okay? What's going to be true is initially, like at the very beginning, my average is whatever that first worker is. Well, I'll draw this a little bit. I should have drawn it down here, so you could really see. It's going to look something like this. Okay? So here's my average product of labor. So in this range here, the marginal productivity of labor was above the average. So what was happening to my average? It was increasing. Okay. Now, once the marginal product of labor gets to be below the average product of labor, okay, what's happening to my average product of labor? Now it starts to decrease. Okay. So typically that point where marginal product of labor and the average product of labor intersects, as long as we have some gains from specialization, that point is going to be somewhere on my diminishing returns part of the marginal productivity of labor curve. Okay? But I don't need to always see these curves. I can just compare the marginal product to the average. If the marginal product is below the old average, I know the new average is going to be lower. The marginal product is above the old average. My new average is going to be a little bit higher, or my average product is increasing. Okay. Okay. All right. So let me think where we're at here. We got about 20 minutes. I did want to get through a little bit more here. Nope. Why isn't this? Did I freeze this? Yes. What's happening? There we go. Okay. Sorry. I don't know why it froze up on me there. So we'll come back to this. We'll do the participation quiz just to make sure we got plenty of time to work through these problems. And then we'll kind of discuss some cost stuff to set us up for next class. So let's go here. So going back a little bit, but let's say we go back and start to thinking about economic versus accounting profits. And we'll hammer this a little bit more home next class as well. But let's say I've got an office space, and all of a sudden, wherever this office space is, the current rent I could be charging is $500. If I own the office space, right, what's going to be happening to my accounting and economic profits? Well, if I own the space, I'm not paying anyone rent. The fact that this space can be rented for $500 more, my accounting profits won't change at all. I'm not paying any money for this space, no matter how much it could be rented for. So we're going to have no change in our accounting profits if we owned the space. However, if I could run this business out of my home instead of the office space, well, what am I foregoing by using the space? I'm not making an additional $500 a month now. So this increase in how much I could be charging for rent would be an implicit cost, or how much money I'm foregoing, right? I'm not making that if I'm using the space. So there, my economic profits would be decreasing. Okay. Now, what if I don't own the space, but I'm renting it? Well, if I'm renting the space, in order to keep renting it, I have to pay an additional $500 a month. That's going to end up being subtracted from my profits, right? So now the explicit cost is 500. Explicit costs will impact both accounting and economic profits. So both of them should be decreasing. When I owned the space, the $500 increase was not an explicit cost. So the accounting profits didn't change at all. When I owned the space, this was a change in the implicit cost, which would change only my economic profits. Okay. Any questions on that before we keep moving here? Okay. So we haven't quite got here, but it'll help us introduce the next concept. So let's say I was looking at a table like this, and I had, what do I have down here? Yeah. So if I've got the cost of each worker is $500, okay? If I had the marginal product of the 200th, or sorry, what do I want here? The marginal product, what would the marginal product of labor be of the 200th unit, right? So if I'm thinking about when I want to produce 200 units, I'm going from 100 to 200. That's my change in quantity. What's the change in the number of workers? Well, that's going from 4 to 6. So the marginal product of that 200th unit, I have to, changing output by 100, I'm adding 2 additional workers. So 100 over 2 would be 50. Now, in terms of the marginal costs, right? We haven't really talked about this yet, but we've talked about the idea of the marginal product of labor increasing or decreasing, okay? So if every single worker costs me the same amount, so I have to pay them each $500, when my workers are more productive or my marginal productivity labor is going up, essentially every unit I'm producing, I have to spend less money on. I'm spending the same $500, but hiring that worker, I'm getting even more output than I was before. So if I have gains from specialization, then I'm going to see that when my marginal productivity of labor is going up, my marginal costs are actually going down. Okay. So I could think about here this relationship between the marginal productivity of labor and my marginal costs, right? So if I think about this, and I've got quantity of labor here, here's my marginal productivity of labor curve, right? And this was kind of like our output, our marginal productivity of labor. For all of these quantities of labor, whenever I've got gains from specialization, if I were to take these output values and then draw out, so this is like output, and I were then to put my costs on the y-axis, anytime I have more productive workers, if I'm paying labor, every worker the same amount, I'm getting more units, but I'm spending the same amount of money. Essentially, per unit, my marginal costs would actually be going down. So this point where we've got gains from specialization, we know that our marginal costs will be decreasing. And then whenever diminishing returns take over, well, there, as I hire more workers, they're less and less productive. I keep having to pay them each worker the same amount of money. Now I'm getting less output per dollar I spend. Oh, hold on. I don't know how you just took over that. You're not supposed to be able to. All right. So for each worker now that I'm adding here, the additional output I'm getting per dollar I'm spending is now going up. So whenever I have gains from specialization, my marginal costs are decreasing. Whenever diminishing returns to labor takes over, now my marginal costs will be increasing. Okay. So we're thinking about this problem. For that 200th unit, what's happening to the marginal productivity of labor? The first 4 workers, what was the marginal productivity of labor? Change was 100 over 4, so 25. And we just said the marginal product of the 200th unit was what, 50? So the marginal productivity of labor is going up or increasing, which means we know that the marginal costs must be decreasing. Okay. Any questions on that before we keep moving? I'm jumping the gun a little bit here with these questions, but I think it'll actually help going through these first before we try to work through or talk about these principles. It's really going to help connect this idea of the marginal product of labor and marginal costs. So let's say I had the same setup, but each worker is costing me $500. Okay. How could I find the marginal cost of the 400th unit? Okay. So if I wanted to know the marginal cost of that 400th unit, what would my total cost be if I wanted to produce 300 units? Well, I would need to pay 9 workers, right? So each worker is going to cost me $500, right? So what would my total cost be if I wanted to produce 300 units? 9 workers times 500 should be $4,500, right? So I'm going to write that down and we'll kind of switch over here in a second, but I want to keep this pulled up, but we'll switch to the dot cam in a second. So at the quantity of 300, our total cost was 4,500. That was simply the number of workers we hired times how much each worker cost us. If I want to go to the point of 400 units of output, I've got to hire 14 workers, right? So now what is my total cost? So 14 times 500, I'm doing math in my head correct here, should be a total cost of $7,000 dollars, right? So I can think about when I was moving between those two quantities, I was coming up with my total cost, simply the quantity of labor times whatever the wage I had to pay those workers was, right? So in this example, this was what? 9 workers times 500, and then I think it was 14 workers times 500. Okay. So if I wanted to calculate marginal costs, what is that? It's the change in my total costs coming from a change in how much I'm producing. Right? That's how we calculate marginal costs. Marginal anything, it's the change in that thing, change in our total costs coming from, well, how are costs changing? Because we're producing more. Okay. So what's the change in my total cost here? I'd have what? 2,500 divided by change in quantity of 100. There, my marginal cost would be 25. Okay. So with this kind of process, if we know something about this quantity of labor, as long as we know the wage, we can then calculate total costs. Once we have total cost and output, we can then calculate our marginal cost, right? So our marginal cost there should be 25. And then we'll go ahead and submit this. Let's make sure I've got everything selected. There we go. Okay. Any questions on that? We'll kind of go through some more examples of this last couple questions here. So if we go back to our Chipotle example, we're not just going to have the cost of our labor, but we're also going to have cost of renting the space as well. So let's add those two things in. So hopefully we now can kind of see, okay, our marginal costs are somehow going to be related to the productivity of our workers. We'll kind of extend this a little bit more. So now I've got this rental space cost of $1,000. The wage is not $500 for each worker, but it's $2,000 per month. So if I want to increase output, I've got to hire more workers, and then each worker I hire, I got to pay $2,000 to. Okay? So we're going to start talking about different types of costs. So here I've got the cost of my building. It doesn't matter how much I produce. The cost of my building is always going to be that same $1,000 of rent or whatever it is. Okay. So if I hire 1 worker, 2, 3, 4, produce 1,000, 1,800 burritos, same cost of that building. Now, if I want to produce more burritos, what's the thing that we were changing in the short run? So the cost of the building we would say is a fixed cost. It's something I can't change, right, in the short run. The thing that I can change is the amount of workers I hire. Each worker I hire costs me $2,000. So the total cost of labor would be the number of workers times 2,000. And that's where that's coming from. What's my total cost? Cost of labor plus the cost of the building. I could fill that column out pretty quickly as well. Okay. Any questions there before we keep moving? All right. So just like we could look at our total output and the marginal product of labor, or kind of like the marginal output of each worker, we can look at total costs and then marginal costs. So here's our total cost, right? Notice if we were to plot out these points, our total cost curve is upward sloping. So with our our production function, our total output curve, it was increasing, but at a decreasing rate because that was reflecting the marginal productivity of labor was decreasing. Well, we said anytime the marginal productivity of labor is decreasing, our marginal costs are actually increasing. So the slope of our total cost curve, well, that would be, how do we find the slope? It's the change in y over the change in x, a change in the total cost divided by a change in the quantity of the good. That is our marginal cost, right? So how do I find the marginal cost? It's the change in the total cost divided by the change in the quantity. That would just be the slope of my total cost curve, okay? So if we calculated marginal costs here, how much is total cost changing by when I want to produce the first 1,000 burritos? $2,000. How much is it changing by? Sorry, 2,000. The change in the total cost is 2,000. If the change in the number of burritos is 1,000, so to get my marginal cost, 2,000 over 1,000 is 2. Now, I have the same change in my total cost when I want to produce 1,800 burritos, right? I've got to hire that second worker. However, now the change in my total cost, I'm only getting 800 additional units, so my marginal cost, 2,000 over 800, is a little bit higher. So this is going back to the original example we had, example 1, where, there we go, where our marginal productivity of labor was only diminishing. So when our marginal productivity of labor is diminishing, scroll all the way back here, our marginal costs in that example would be increasing. Oops. And there, I'm finding these values by simply looking at the change in the total cost divided by the change in quantity. Okay. So I've got these increasing marginal costs, right? Anytime marginal costs are increasing, right? We said we knew we were on the diminishing portion of that marginal productivity of labor curve. Okay. So if I graph these out, instead of kind of the marginal productivity of labor being like downward sloping, my marginal cost curve is going to be upward sloping. Okay. Let me think. What do I want to do here? Put this in here. We'll talk more about firm's cost tomorrow. Well, let's do this. Move this slide around a little bit. So I kind of already related this here. But if you can think about, we could put this all on the same kind of graph. So I could have like my quantity of labor, and in this example, going like 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Right. We could then find the corresponding quantity of the output or the product. So this was like our burritos. Right. I think this was the values. Okay. Well, from this, we can calculate the marginal productivity of labor, right? So that was 1,000, 800, 600, 400, 200. Well, what was our total costs, right? Here, I don't have to factor in my fixed costs if I don't want to. I'll kind of show you end up with the same values and actually make a point with that. So let's say I just think about the cost of labor here. So we said each worker was $2,000. So 2,000, 4,000. This is just how much total I'm spending on my workers. I could then find my marginal cost because that's just the change in the total cost divided by the change in the quantity, right? So this was what we had 250. What were the other values here? And a cheat. 333, 5, and 10. All right, so I'm just change in total cost here was like 2,000 divided by 200. That gave me that marginal cost of 10. Okay. So really, we could have all this together. Whenever my marginal productivity labor is decreasing, my marginal costs are going to be, can't really use the arrow here, but notice they're increasing, right? So my marginal productive labor is decreasing, my marginal costs are increasing. Okay. What's going to end up being true is anytime we had that marginal productivity of labor going up, we actually would see that our marginal costs are going down, right? That was the graph that we had. And here, this is, I would kind of make this connection. I'm going to draw it again just to really hammer this idea home. So if I'm looking at my marginal productivity of labor curve, we know that it's not always diminishing, and that initially I have this gains from specialization before that diminishing returns to labor takes over. Okay. Because my total cost really, like I can think about this quantity is a function of the quantity of labor. When I was calculating total costs were quantity of labor times a wage. Notice I've got the quantity of labor in each one, so they're going to be related. So there, if I'm thinking about, well, hold on. I wish I had a little bigger of a space here. I shouldn't have wrote this where I did. So I'll do this again real quick since we're ending class here. Marginal productivity of labor. We had gains from specialization. We had our diminishing returns portion. So we said that if I'm thinking about the quantity of the product, and I'm thinking about kind of the cost in terms of dollars, anytime our workers are becoming more effective, as long as we have this example where we're paying the same wage rate to every worker. So this breaks down a little bit if we pay workers different wages. It just gets a little bit more complicated mathematically, but it makes a lot of sense in, like the Chipotle example, everyone behind the counter is getting paid the same hourly wage rate. We would actually see that when there's gains from specialization, that as I start to hire more workers and produce more initially, my marginal costs will be decreasing, right? So anytime my marginal productivity of labor is increasing, my marginal costs are decreasing. And then anytime I've got diminishing returns or my marginal productivity of labor is going down, that's going to mean my marginal costs are going up. So where is the lowest possible point on that marginal cost curve? Where diminishing returns starts to take over. Okay. Any questions on this idea before we keep moving here? Got a couple more minutes before we end. So where were we at? All right. So next class, we're going to kind of start talking about different types of costs for the firm. We've now kind of got this idea of marginal cost, marginal productive labor. So what are we going to do tomorrow? So you can think about this as a firm is trying to maximize profits. Right? So what is the firm's revenue? The firm's revenue is going to be the number of units they sell times the price. Okay. Well, if I want to increase revenue, right, I can increase the number of units I produce and I'll make more money. However, in order to increase that output, I have to hire more workers. Well, I know that as I hire more workers, that's going to increase my costs. And we said eventually, as I hire more workers, what's going to happen to the output added per worker? It's going to start going down. That marginal product of labor is going to go down, which we said does what to my marginal costs? Increases them. So eventually, producing more will start to increase my marginal costs, right? Now, by producing more, I'm also increasing revenues by whatever that price of the good is, okay? Well, there's going to be some point where the amount of money added to revenue is going to be below the additional cost of getting one more unit from hiring another worker. Right? So as long as the marginal cost of adding another worker is below the additional revenue I can earn, which is essentially the price, then I'm okay hiring it. Right? So we'll start to think less about kind of the quantity of labor next class and a lot more about the firms choosing output levels of the product. But behind all of these output levels of the product, we always have, where is it at? Not here, right? Behind the output of product, we always have the quantity of labor as well, okay? So we'll pick up on this tomorrow. I think we should have more than enough time to kind of get through the rest of Module 9's material. There's a lot more slides, but you can kind of see here, I've got a bunch of photos at the end, so this will go kind of quick. Other than that, I think that should cover it. We got the participation quiz in. If you want to do an additional check, even if you did that class participation, make sure whatever device you're planning to use Friday, I would run this test quiz to make sure that the lockdown browser is working and downloaded on that device. Okay? All right. So I'll end the recording there. We'll see you guys tomorrow.